Welcome to the second and actually final lecture for week 3. We're getting off a little light on as far as number of lectures, um, but not so light as far as the difficulty of the material because now you're reading Kant in his own words. For the most part for this course, Rachel's because it's very clearly written in contemporary language, but it's important to read some of the actual philosophers, and Kant is such a big name in ethics, along with Mill, that we really should read it. It'll be a relatively short lecture. It's a relatively short passage that we read, um, but Kant always requires sort of careful reading and maybe repeated reading to really get him. So, read it once, and then I'll explain it, and then maybe read it again. All right. Kant's project is to analyze morality, which says in its everyday application has a great deal of empirical content. So what does that mean? So, you know, by empirical, he means sort of dealing with objects in the world, the sensory world, um, as opposed to like pure reason, pure rationality, right? So when he applies that to morality, he's saying everyday moral decisions are, actual like concrete ones about a particular situation with involving actual people, actual things in the world, right? Um, but there is something about morality that is sort of independent of the empirical world, in that it's supposed to be universal, right? So um, again, we've talked about ethics, right, and morality as these most general kind of normative statements, these should or ought statements that just hold all the time. So it's not just you should do this if you want to get to school on time or if you want to make $1 million. It's you should do this, period, right? That's that's the realm of ethics. And there's something about those completely general laws that are sort of like the particular situation is sort of irrelevant, right? Because it applies at all times, no matter what the details of the situation are. Uh, the only other sorts of laws that are absolute in this way, that always apply, Kant thinks, are the laws of logic, right? Um, so this sort of suggests, doesn't necessarily like demonstrate, but it shows a similarity between moral laws and rational laws. They're so general that they don't depend on whatever particular facts happen to be true, right, of the world. Um, and as such, they could be discovered by pure reason. So Kant begins chapter 1 with a claim that the only thing in the world that can be truly said to be morally good is a good will. So right away, he sets himself apart from the utilitarians, right? Because the utilitarians say the only thing that is good in itself is pleasure, right? The lack of pain. Very different thing. Kant says, nope, it's not that. It's a good will. There are a lot of other good things in the world, right? Even good character traits, right? Intelligence, talent, things like that. But he says those are only really good if they're employed by a good will, right? Otherwise, they become evil. A very intelligent person, right, that is using that talent with a bad will create bad, right? Will do bad. Um, Even happiness can be bad if it's a bad person, right? That's happy. Like Hitler's happiness is kind of a bad thing because you know that he tends to be happy when bad things happen, right? Um, and even like we haven't talked a lot about Aristotle. We'll get into it when we talk about virtue ethics, right? But these sort of Aristotle's virtues, like moderation, right, coolness, courage, which is he's we'll get into it more, but he's got this idea of like the golden mean and sort of like all the virtues, all the virtues are like in the middle of this mean between, cowardliness and foolhardiness. Somewhere in the middle is courage and stuff like that. And that may be true, but Kant says on their own, even those are can be bad, right? So you can be a super cool, right, super measured, intelligent, um, right? And importantly, for Kant, consequences don't matter at all, right? If what's the only thing that's really good is a good will, right? sort of a good intention coming from the right place, your actions, um, and whether or not you achieve your goal, because the world is unpredictable, uh, that has nothing to do with whether you were good, right? Whether the intention was good. And this part of Kant really does sort of accord well with, I think, our intuitions, and in a sense, utilitarianism doesn't, where we really do think that, uh, if I'm trying to save your life, right, but I accidentally break your arm in the process, nobody's going to say, man, what a bad guy you are, Nate. You broke that person's arm, right? They understand that your intention was good, right? And that's something that I think Kant's account sort of captures, that utilitarians would have to say, like particularly say it was the situation was like, I'm trying to save your life, but it turns out like you wouldn't have died anyways. Maybe I thought you were going to fall off a bridge, but you really weren't. I go to try to help you, and then I break your arm in the process, so I actually end up causing more pain than there would have been otherwise, right? The utilitarian would have to say, you did a bad thing. And, there's some pull on our intuitions in that way too, right? They both capture important parts. But I think Kant often sort of wins out over the utilitarians on this point. So, Kant's concentrating on this again, this idea of like, many moral decisions are very concrete. They're in the real world. Um, so you might worry that saying that the will alone is the only thing that's good, right? Regardless of how it's sort of applied or what the consequences are, how could that be true, right? Is goodness really something that abstract? And Kant says, well, think of it this way, right? Um, Suppose that the will wasn't the thing that is good. Suppose that, like the utilitarians, the goal is actually happiness, pleasure, something else more concrete, right? Um, Kant says if that was the whole point of being human, right, the ultimate thing we're all aiming for, um, we wouldn't need these complex rational minds that we have, where we're able to sort of think very abstractly. Right? Again, pleasure was the goal. Instinct alone is sufficient to direct us towards that, right? Sort of a version of the swine objection, right? Saying, yeah, I mean, a dog can make itself happy. A dog can seek pleasure too, right? Um, if there weren't some other purpose for humans, why would we have all this complex intellectual machinery, right? All these powerful brains. Um, so the fact that we are not, by and large, governed by instinct, but instead are governed by reason, um, he says that points to a much more abstract purpose and much more abstract thing that humans are seeking, right? Um, and we're supposed to use that reason, right? And that reason is supposed to lead us to, uh, right, the good and the goodwill. The good is the goodwill, right, that can guide our actions appropriately and use reason appropriately instead of for evil. Okay, so let's say we agree with Kant so far. So, what makes a will good then? Well, according to Kant, goodwill is one that directs action in accordance with duty. Uh, so duties are things that you must do, right? Moral laws. So how do we know if your will is a good one? Is it doing it? Is it following its duty, right? Is it following the moral laws? Um, Again, the special thing about moral laws is they apply to everyone, right? So that the existence of a moral law will impose a duty on every single person. Now, sometimes you might do your duty sort of by accident or for other reasons, right? So again, it's not the action that is judged, but the will, the intention behind it, right? Um, so it's only actually good if you do the thing because it's your duty, right? If you follow the rule because you're deliberately trying to follow that rule and not some other rule that accidentally sort of coincides with it in that moment, right? So for example, suppose you have a store and you charge fair prices, right? Um, that could be a good thing, right? That might be you following your duty, but we'd have to sort of peer inside your mind and see why, right? So if it turns out that that's just the best business model and you find that you make the most profit, right? If you charge reasonable prices and you get more people in the door, right? Kind of the way, was it Costco sells those $5 chickens for like, below cost. It costs them money, but it's like a good business practice. People love them and it gets more people coming back to Costco, right? Or are they doing that out of duty or some sort of like some some deeply moral sense? Probably not, right? They're probably doing it because they find it increases their profit. Um, So again, charging fair prices would be coming from a goodwill that's doing its duty if you are doing it in order to be fair, right? Instead of you get so this only good thing is a goodwill, right? And you have to know why people are doing things. That you get some kind of interesting cases, right? So, for example, Kant thinks that you can know for sure that someone's doing their duty um, when they just get no joy out of it, right? They hate doing the right thing, and yet they do it. For example, maybe you hate life and you really wish you were dead, right? But nonetheless, you know that you have a duty to preserve human life, right? You can't commit suicide, that would be wrong. So you continue to live and slog it out, right? Kant would say, okay, then we know you're acting normally, right? Sorry, morally. Yeah, I think he has another example where, some rich person that really just hates giving to charity, right? Like doesn't like it all, doesn't get any sort of like pleasure or good feeling out of it, but does it nonetheless because they know it is their duty, right? Um, that's when you really know, right? No other motives involved. Now, of course, both can happen, right? You can do something because it's your duty. You can also get pleasure out of it. Fine, right? But it's about what's the reason for your actions. Right? Okay, so um, again, what is the Kantian view of morality? Well, okay, first of all, what's the thing that's good? It's not good or bad, right? It's not actions like for utilitarians. It's the will. That's the thing that's good or bad. And how do we know if a will is good? We know if it's good if it's doing its duty, right? Okay, well, so how do we know what our duty is? Um, well, we know that duties are not determined by their consequences, right? Kant already said that. Um, it's not, again, it doesn't rely on just sort of the details and probabilities of the real actual world, right? It can't be sort of that accidental, whether something is good or bad. It must be much more abstract and pure and rational. So, know what your duty is, right? Um, by the principle, you know if you're doing your duty, if you're following the principle, right? So, again, why am I charging fair prices, right? Ask a person why are they doing that? What rule are they following? If the rule is, well, maximize profit, and that turns out that you end up charging lower prices, well, then they're not. That's a different situation than if they're following the maxim, always be fair in business, right? So, is somebody doing the duty? You need to know what maxim they're following, right? Um, so, what is the principle that determines our duty, right? How do we know which maxim is the one we should be following? Which maxim is our duty? We could be following a number of different maxims in our actions, right? Well, here's how we get to the categorical imperative, which we saw in the last lecture, right? So again, the most general moral law is also a general rational law, which says I am never to act otherwise than so that I could also will that my maxim should become a universal law. And we walked through this in the last lecture, right? Saying I want to do something. Is it a moral thing to do? Ask myself, what rule am I following? If my rule is always maximize profit, right? And you ask yourself, should everyone do that? And so on, right? You ask yourself, you thinking about breaking a promise, right? What rule am I following? It's okay to break a promise if you get something out of it. Okay, would I want everyone to follow that rule, right? And if it ends up being some sort of like contradiction or like society collapses or it just sort of becomes impossible to promise in a world where all promises can be broken, then you know there's a problem with it, right? Whereas if you can say, yeah, I want everybody to act that way, it would be fine. Everyone should follow that rule. Then it's the moral thing to do. And this is sort of the essence of morality, right? It applies to everyone, rational laws, right? Just like the laws of logic. So the duties we have then are to follow the laws that we would want everyone to follow all the time, right? Our duty is to follow universal law. Moral laws are just the most universal laws. And again, we've seen this example before, promises, right? Suppose in a different situation, instead of the loan, say I promised a friend that I will help her move, and then the day comes, I really don't feel like it. I'd much rather sleep in and watch TV all day. Should I break my promise? Again, Kant says, okay, what maxim would you be following, right? And I'll say, I guess I'm following it's okay to break promises if you don't feel like keeping them, right? And then you say, well, could I make it that a universal law? Everyone follows that says it's okay to break promises if you don't feel like keeping them. Again, no, that would make promises meaningless, and there'd no longer be any such thing as promising. There'd be no point in promising. No one would ever believe that you keep the promise, and promising ceases to be a thing. Right? So importantly, it's not simply that sort of whether you would want everyone to act like that, right? But it's literally that you couldn't have everybody act like that without it somehow collapsing into incoherence, right? Moral laws are not just like laws that it would be nice if everybody followed, or there would be good consequences if everybody followed. They're more akin to rational laws, where um, everyone has to follow them, or else we sort of run into a kind of contradiction. And again, lots of debate over in what sense this is contradiction, right? That happens. Um, but maybe interesting for paper topic. But that's the basic idea. So very short lecture, right? I just wanted to walk you through the Kant reading. I think if you'd already read, the Rachels and watched that lecture, that makes the Kant much easier. But he's always a slightly tough read. That's it for this week for lectures, and I'll see you next week.